I'm going to talk with you a little bit today about the history of animals in space. A lot of this is going to be about dogs in space, both because they're the first animals in space, and also because I have a dog and I like dogs, and I find it really interesting. And the reason I want to talk about this, this gets at some of the questions about ethics in space. It gets about some questions we might have about what kinds of scientific research are we comfortable with, but also because the history of it points to some of the complexities that came up in the very early space race, which arguably continue to this point today. But also because I get to tell stories about dogs, and I like talking about dogs constantly. Okay, 3 big questions that are worth just keeping in the back of your head as we're talking about this. Question number 1, has the knowledge we get from experimenting with animals in space, and you could say not in space, been worth the suffering of those animals? The animals don't usually get any say on whether they're experimented on, and that's the case in space, it's the case on Earth, and we could think about this because we did get knowledge from it, and the animals did suffer, and does it balance out? I don't know, but that's a question to be thinking about. Number 2, should we think about space research as being different than other types of research? We use animals to do health research. We use animals to do cosmetic research, to make makeup and things like that. Is space special? Is space a different domain? Should we think of it as something different, or should we just say, well, animal research is animal research? Okay, next one. Do we care about the type of animals? Does it vary? Do our ethics of it change? Depending on if it's a dog, for example, which we all feel, maybe not all of us, I speak for myself, which some of us feel very strongly about, whereas it might be a spider or, say, a cat, which are animals that nobody cares about. I'm just kidding. People like cats. But spiders people generally don't like, right? And do we care if you put a spider into space? People do care about dogs in space. And this is a nice way to probe how we feel about the ethics of animals in general and whether or not we rate certain animals as being more important than other animals and whether we should or not. First animal in space was put into space in November 1957. This was on the world's second satellite put into space by the Soviet Union. You may have heard about the first satellite, which we pronounce as Sputnik. Fun fact, in Russian it's Sputnik. Now you know. You can go tell all your friends you know how to pronounce it correctly, which just means like your little satellite, your little traveler, your little friend. And the Russians had put up the first satellite in October 1957, and then they put up their second satellite in November 1957. This is still before the United States had put up any satellites. And they told the world about it. They were very proud of this. They were saying, look at what we've done. We've put up the satellite, and unlike the first satellite, which just had sort of a radio transmitter on it, this one had scientific instruments. Specifically, it had stuff that could tell you about the weather and tell you about the temperature of space, and it also had other things that would tell you about radiation in space, and also there's a dog. And this is more or less how the Russians presented it. And people said, wait. Did you say a dog? And they said, yeah, there's a little dog right there. You see it? It's in compartment number 8. There's a little dog in there. And they said, wait, you put a dog in your satellite? And they're like, yeah, so we can understand if animals can survive in space and things like that. And then the next question was, what's the dog's name? And the Soviet Union did not anticipate this whatsoever. They thought people are going to see this as just like we're doing a science experiment, and of course it uses a living thing, which is a dog. What do you mean, what's its name? People in the West in particular, we name our dogs. We want to know the dog's name. We don't consider a dog to be a scientific experiment by itself. We consider this to be some little creature. This could have been somebody's pet or something like that. And things that we care about, we give names. And the Soviets were so dumbfounded by this that they didn't even know what name to give. They gave about 3 different names before they finally decided, its name is Laika, which means barker, little barker in Russian. And that became its name. So this is Laika. Laika, like all of the Soviet space dogs, was a stray dog from the streets of Moscow. And the Soviet philosophy was, if a dog can survive on the streets of Moscow, it can survive in outer space. And so you could make a joke about Brooklyn or something like that, some other place for a dog to survive on the streets here. And Laika was a little dog. They like these little compact dogs. They like these little mutts. Mutts have good, hybrid vigor in them, not a purebred. And they're really well trained. and they're easy to take care of. Dogs are super straightforward to take care of. The Soviets had actually looked at using monkeys and looking like, what does it take to like raise monkeys? And the answer is like a zoo. It's very hard. And also monkeys have hands and can undo themselves and are hard to train. Whereas a dog, if you got a good dog, and I don't know how many of you out there have good dogs, you train a dog to sit there and be still, it'll sit there and be still even if you put it on a rocket, right? The depressing thing about Laika, they never had any intention of getting her back. They were just going to put her up. And then she was going to die up there at some point. And they told the Americans and the Western Europeans this, and they said, oh my God, you guys are monsters. Now, the Soviet Union was not a very nice place anyway, and they killed like millions of people. But it's the dog that got people really mad because we identify with the dog. We have dogs. This is a really cruel thing to do to a dog. Put it in space, no way to come back. They were going to check its heart rate, check how it was doing, and eventually their plan was to feed it poison so it would die and be out of its suffering. Oh yeah, there's Laika in her little capsule. Laika's a very good dog. We can all say this. Yeah, very adorable dog. Well, there were protests. This is a photo shoot, of course, but these are dogs protesting at the United Nations. We protest inhuman treatment, pick on guys your own size, send up Khrushchev, the head of the Soviet Union, instead. We are faithful, be faithful to us. And in a way, this is a publicity stunt on the West as well, right? A response to the publicity stunt of the Soviet Union, but it does reflect actual considerations. People were deeply unsettled by this. As an aside, we now know that Laika didn't even survive all the way into space because they rushed it so quickly to put the rocket up that they did not actually finish parts of the rocket. They did not finish the cooling system, so she overheated. But that was kept as a secret for 50 years because that was seen as so disturbing that even the Soviet Union couldn't admit that they did it. We only found that out in the 1990s when the archives were opened up. They lied and said she survived a week up there, and then we had to euthanize her. But anyway, even the Soviets felt like they had gone maybe a little bit too far with that. So on the one hand, first animal in space. On the other hand, really sad story, right? And I don't lie to students. It's a bad, form. But I did actually once lie to students because a student said to me, but didn't they at least get good scientific data from Laika? And I said, sure, they did. They totally did, which is not true. They got no good data from Laika. It's really sad. Soviet Union, as an aside, Laika was not the first dog to be put into a rocket. They did lots of dog stuff well before Laika, before they put her on a full rocket to go to space. They had smaller rockets. They had a very large dog program. They had probably 100 dogs. Probably about 30 of them went on rockets. Many of them survived. Some of them went on many rockets. Some of them didn't survive. The next dogs they put in space was not till 1960. These are Belka and Strelka, both of whom were veterans of the Soviet rocket dog programs. They had been in rockets many times. And this time, the Soviet Union understood what the game was, and they were going to bring them back. So they put these two dogs up, a male and a female, cute little dogs, again, rugged Moscow strays, put them up, and brought them back. Hooray, Belka and Strelka came back. Used this as a massive opportunity for publicity. Everybody was so horrified by Laika, it almost took away from some of the achievement. Now everybody can be excited. And this is the guy who's in charge of the dog program. He's genuinely happy. These people, by the way, the scientists, they were not unfeeling, cold people. They hated what happened to Laika. They later said they regretted it. They thought it was totally unnecessary. If they hadn't been pushed by Khrushchev to be so fast, they would have devised a way to bring it back. These are real people over here. Not only like Belka and Strelka come back, but they had puppies, which is super, one, adorable. Two, indicates that going to space doesn't make it so you can't have children anymore, which is kind of exciting. And three, did I mention they are adorable? Not only did they have these puppies, they took one of these puppies, they gave it to the Kennedys. So Caroline Kennedy got my Russian is sloppy, Pushinka, and who was a child of Belka and Strelka, and there are actually descendants of Pushinka still alive. These dogs, it's like a very exciting thing to have one of these dogs. As an aside, the satellites were first called Sputniks. The Americans then called the dogs Mutniks, and then the little ones were called the Pupniks, as And I point that out not just because it's amusing, because it kind of is, but also it shows you how this is part of this like media discussion of this. It's not just science. It's science in its culture. It's science as propaganda. It's science as diplomacy, as giving a little space dog puppy to the Kennedys was. And the Kennedys like Pushinka a lot. Interestingly, within the Soviet Union, they also capitalized on the adorableness of space dogs. And this is just an interesting little aspect. In Soviet, especially in the 1950s and 60s, in the Soviet Union, you're not allowed to have like pop stars. You're not allowed to have heroes other than Lenin and Marx and a bunch of guys who were really boring and you wouldn't want to put them on your lunchbox, right? Like political people. You can't have human beings who are stars, because in the Soviet ideology, everybody is basically the same and nobody is specialer than anybody else. And so the only people who matter are political heroes. But there's a loophole. You can have animals as stars. And so the space dogs become like literally things you could put on a lunchbox, and it's like a sort of pop culture in the Soviet Union. So we have a Belka and Strelka, some sort of ceramic thing on the left with the two dog heads. That postcard with Belka and Strelka on it says Happy New Year. Up on top right is a candy dish. In the center is a Leica clock. And the bottom left is another Leica clock, but also has Lenin, which I thought was a nice. You can have both, right? The bottom right is a book, which if you're interested in any of this, heavily recommended. It's called Soviet Space Dogs, and it is all about these dogs, and it is all about the not just the dog training program, but also the kitsch, the silly stuff that was used to promote the dogs and space travel and make the Soviets feel really good about space travel. You could celebrate the dogs because they are heroes of the Soviet Union. The United States also put up animals. They started with this little monkey called Miss Baker in 1959. I don't remember offhand if Miss Baker survived. I feel bad. I feel like she survived. She was put in a Jupiter missile. The one that was sort of the United States' chief animal was a chimpanzee who was really hard to train and was really difficult. And some of these monkeys could get out of their harnesses and wreck the experiments. There's a reason dogs work better. This is one that they named Ham, and he was the first chimpanzee in space. And you can see he's pretty cute too, actually. He's a young chimpanzee. He's not the rip your arms off chimpanzee. He's still kind of cute chimpanzee. And did they bring Ham back alive? Of course they bring Ham back alive. The United States is much more media savvy. They're not going to send up a chimpanzee to die. But on the other hand, one thing I like to point out about Ham, we talk about the Soviet Union and the Soviet program and how much it's very Cold War and how it tells you about their society and all that. Ham's original name, before they named it Ham and put him on the cover of stuff, was Chop Chop Chang. So it's this sort of racist, anti-Asian name, and it just shows you that this is happening in its own culture too, which is the sort of Eisenhower era United States. And today we have a little bit more better understanding of that. If you've seen Hidden Figures, for example, you see that there's way more than just the fancy guys who went to the moon that got people to the moon and all that. But I just like to point that out, that this permeates their culture too. This feels like an Eisenhower thing. Since then, many countries have put up animals in space for science experiments. The French put up a cat, the only cat anybody ever tried to put into space. Cats are not easy animals to put into space. They're not easy animals to give a bath. They're really tricky. Félicité, she did go up and then come back down and did survive, so good for her. Most recent animals in space are not interesting. They're like little microbes. However, they did on the International Space Station not very long ago put spiders in space to see how they spun webs in microgravity. So this is the kind of experiment you might do. How important is gravity to a spider making its web the way it is? Let's put it in space and find out. Let's put it in a place with no gravity, and they will still make gravities in space, but not gravities. They'll still make webs in space, but they come out kind of weird. Leica is sort of a martyr for space. She's the one. There were other animals who died in the process of this, but Leica was the one where there was never any chance of survival. In the Soviet Union, they have only as of 2008 created a special monument just for Leica to thank Leica for her services and recognize that she did help them in space, even if she didn't give them data, even if it was just propaganda, even if it just opened up a conversation about what our ethics are for experimentation on these things. Leica participated in the Soviet space program to the same degree in a way that Yuri Gagarin did. And Yuri Gagarin, first man in space, famously asked, or supposedly asked, if he was the first man in space or the last dog in space, but which is just a funny Yuri Gagarin joke. But I think this is kind of appropriate. And next slide. This is another Soviet. This is a Soviet mural, not a Russian mural, of the heroes of space, called the conquerors of space. And you can see there's men and women, and there's people making stuff, and there's people thinking very hard because they're scientists. And there's really, if you go back, you get some people who look like they're doing really, technical stuff. But if you zoom in, if you can hit the button one more time, you'll see that there's Laika is also considered a conqueror of space. So they've actually integrated her into there. So anyway, that's more or less what I was going to talk about, tell you some stories about space dogs. Going back to our big questions, how do we feel about this? Obviously, everybody is super sad about Laika, right? Like, naturally so. But it is interesting to probe what's the limit of this. And again, we use animals for research all the time in the Cold War. At the same time that the Soviets killed Laika, the United States had things like studies on what happens if you expose a dog to radiation. And that's not because they're anti-dog, it's because you need to know that if humans are going to be safe around radiation, and dogs can model that to a degree because they're little mammals, right? Is that good? Is that bad? Is that worse than Laika? Is that better than Laika because we can say exactly what the health benefit is? I don't know. Like, this is what makes ethics interesting, is that lots of people can have different takes on this and different opinions on it. All right, that's my presentation. Thank you very much.